of all, I would like to start off by saying welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for making this commitment of your time and your energy to join us here today, to share your experiences and hopefully to learn from one another what is being done with regards to displaced people. As you can see, I put this quote up this morning because I wanted this quote to set the tone for the work that we are all doing and that we're going to be doing today. It's a reminder about the humanity that needs to be inserted into and incorporated into all of our efforts. We need to remember that we are dealing with human beings here who have very human problems, and that before we pick up the phone and ask somebody to sweep them off the streets, that we understand that there is a reason why they are on the street, and that thanks to all of you, there are also solutions available to help the people who are on the streets because they have no other option. Of course, as you know, there are some people who are on the streets of Johannesburg. In fact, we are talking now about an amount of nearly 1 million people who are on the streets of Johannesburg currently, and for all various different reasons. There are some people who are on the streets because they shouldn't be there. There are some criminal elements who we know hide out amongst the groups of displaced people. And there are people who have homes and families but who choose to be on the streets. Some of them for reasons of employment. We have casual laborers who sleep on the streets at night close to a potential place of work because they don't want to spend the little money they earn doing casual labor on transport to go home. So they prefer to sleep on the streets of suburbs where they can get employment. But in terms of the criminal elements, these people opportunistically hide out amongst the groups of displaced people. They even receive money and donations from some of us, thinking that they are people who need help, and in the meantime they shouldn't be there. And what we're trying to do in this initiative is we're trying to create that distinction between the people who can receive help, that we can help, and the people who just shouldn't be there. Because we need to remember that there are also laws. And the laws work for the rights of all citizens of South Africa. We have the Constitution of South Africa that says that everybody has the right to shelter, everybody has the right to education and to dignity, human dignity, and we must remember that as well. There are national laws that protect children and vulnerable children, orphans and vulnerable children, sorry, and there are laws about the children's rights to education and to people's right to housing and shelter, etc. So there are national laws. There are national laws obviously against various crimes, and then there are bylaws as well. Now in the bylaws, people are not allowed to sleep on the streets, and that is for a very, very practical reason. People believe that people are not allowed to sleep on the streets because it's purely a nuisance factor. It's not about purely nuisance. It's also because it is unsafe and unhealthy for these people to be on the streets. And this is why so many of us have come together to try and find a humane solution so that people can find shelter and can find hopefully training and employment opportunities, because remember, that is another aim of what we're trying to do here today. We are trying to break that cycle that forces people to be on the streets, and that is unemployment, homelessness, joblessness, and living on the streets. If we can, there are so many people who just want to go back to school, or just want to go back to their homes, or who just need a little hand up in the form of training and support. In our last workshop we had Kenneth. Is Kenneth here? No, he's possibly going to come a little bit later. We had a young gentleman here called Kenneth, who is a person who used to live on the streets. And he was living on the streets out of sheer hopelessness, until one day a member of the community actually bothered to ask him what his situation was and what help he needed. And it was thanks to that help that that person in the community gave him, that hand up that allowed him to receive an education, to make some money, and today he is working for an NGO in Melville that helps other homeless people, particularly street kids in Melville. Now, speaking about children, I was very privileged yesterday and the day before to participate in a conference organized by Save the Children on children's rights. And for those of you who are involved with street children, orphans and vulnerable children, I also invite the members here of human development, social assistance, the other city officials that are here, anybody who deals with children, child welfare and children's rights. I have brought a whole load of books and literature that you are very welcome to help yourselves to. And there's a specific book and magazine with lots and lots of information in it on street children. So please feel free, it's all on that table over there, please feel free to help yourself to that. So one of the expectations, or rather one of the objectives of this workshop, is to produce a handbook or a guide that we can use in order to help our organizations and to help members of the community, to help law enforcement, to help the city officials and any other person who is dealing with displaced people to help them. And so this handbook, we hope, will include information on shelters, information on rehabilitation centers, information, welcome, information on the protocols as well, because there are specific protocols that need to be followed in terms of how to help displaced people. Now, when you're considering the protocols, we need to understand that we are dealing with a very, very heterogeneous group of people that are living on the streets of Johannesburg and indeed on the streets of South Africa. Now, we say they're heterogeneous. We've mentioned some of the groups. There are people who are homeless, unemployed, there are orphans and vulnerable children, there are abused women as well who have no choice but to find shelter on the streets because they have no support system to turn to. There are job seekers, casual laborers, and then there are substance abusers as well. We have a lot of young children, too many young children and adolescents on the streets of Johannesburg who are addicted to substances from glue and dagga or marijuana to much more serious substances, like we heard in our last workshop, a substance called wunga. And that is a combination, a very scary combination of dagga, heroin, and antiretrovirals. Because somewhere, someone discovered that antiretrovirals give you a high, and now we are finding situations in South Africa where people who genuinely have HIV are going to clinics to receive medication, but who are out of poverty and desperation are selling their medication to drug dealers, who are then selling it on to other people. And I'm not sure if everybody here realizes what a potential disaster we're dealing with, because besides the narcotic aspect, we're talking about a potential health disaster. We already are one of the worst affected countries in the world in terms of HIV infection. And I'm not sure if you know about how the virus is transmitted and how we land up with resistant strains of HIV. But one of the ways is by people not taking their medication correctly, or by sharing medication, anything that is done that allows the virus to get a hold of your immune system, that allows the virus to continue replicating, makes a more resistant strain of virus. And this is one of the ways, ladies and gentlemen, by taking antiretrovirals when you are not infected by HIV, means that your body already develops some kind of tolerance for the medication. Taking this kind of drug when you are HIV infected means that potentially if you had to transmit HIV to another person, you are actually giving them a resistant strain of HIV, which means they pass on a resistant strain possibly to somebody else, and you have a health disaster. So this is an area of tremendous concern. But coming back to the narcotic aspect, we have a lot of kids, a lot of people, we have people who are addicted to alcohol as well on the streets, and who are on the streets because of their addiction. One of the biggest problems that we uncovered in our last workshop was the fact that these people will not be accepted into shelters as long as they are addicted to a substance. And the reason is purely practical, because they create too much of a disturbance, because they potentially are very difficult to manage. They try to escape so that they can get back onto the streets and get their next fix. And so the shelters will not take them. And that poses us an enormous problem, because it means that we have to find a rehabilitation solution, a free rehabilitation solution for a lot of these adolescents, so that they can get cleaned up, get off the drugs, and then find shelter and hopefully training opportunities, and go back to school or find a job. So that is one of the big missing links that we have, is we need to, there's no state-run rehabilitation center that we know of currently in this area that can provide free rehabilitation, because what these kids need is about at least 6 months or more of rehabilitation before we can put them in a shelter or a training program or help them in any other way. So we're going to be looking into that. And the protocols deal with how to recognize when somebody has a substance problem, so that you know who the appropriate organization or person is to take them to. We're going to be hearing a little bit later on today about mental illness. There are, I was shocked to hear of the nearly 1 million people in Johannesburg who are living on the streets. And in fact, I think the statistic is for South Africa in general. 1/3 of the people who are living on the streets suffer from mental illness. And they're on the streets because of this mental illness, and because their friends or family, if they have any, don't know what to do with them. And the communities that they live in also don't know what to do with them. And so they are abandoned there. So we're going to have doctors from Cllr who are going to come and speak to us today, who are going to talk to us about the mental health protocol. They're going to talk to us about how to recognize when somebody is mentally ill and what can be done. They're also going to be coming to us because they're going to be asking for help. And they need help because very often we have homeless people who manage to get into the system, who manage to get into mental health institutions like Cllr, receive treatments, receive medication, and then it comes time to discharge them because they cannot be kept there indefinitely, and then the hospital doesn't know where to discharge them to. And unfortunately what happens is sometimes they land up back on the street because they say, where do you live? And the address they give is maybe a vacant lot somewhere. And even though the hospital, with the very best of intentions, provides them with their medication, they cannot rely on that person to continue coming back for their medication. They don't even know if this person has water at the place where they've been left to take that medication. And unfortunately what happens is the vicious cycle starts again, because it's a matter of days or weeks before the person finds themselves in exactly the same situation as they were when they first got into the system and started receiving treatment. So we're going to be looking at that as well today. Just in terms of the handbook, let's have a look at, we're going to be going over this a little bit later this afternoon as well, but I just wanted to give you a look of the skeleton or draft outline of what I believe this handbook should contain. So the opening quote is what I would like to open the handbook with. And then after the quote, we have the introduction, just talking about why we talk about displaced people and not the homeless or vagrants. Now, even though vagrants is a term that is actually very neutral in the dictionary, where a vagrant is defined as somebody who wanders from place to place without a home or without fixed employment. A lot of people believe, and I think rightly so, that the term vagrant is quite derogatory because it has that feeling of somebody that we don't want on the streets. Homeless is not entirely appropriate for the people living on our streets in our suburbs, because not all of these people are necessarily homeless. We've spoken about casual laborers, we've spoken about people with mental illness who have homes and families but are there for other reasons. We've spoken about people who have a substance problem who are there because of their addiction. They are not necessarily homeless or familyless. And this is exactly why we talk about displaced people. They are displaced from their homes, they are displaced from their communities. And remember, a very important group as well that we are dealing with in almost all our suburbs are illegal immigrants. They are people who find themselves on the streets because they cannot get the right papers to allow them to find shelter and find employment. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we have a situation where we believe that we do not want to put refugees in a refugee camp like many other countries do. That is fair and well, but the problem is that although we grant people refugee status, that does not come with a work permit. So in essence, we're saying you can come and find safety here in this country, but you cannot work to support yourself. And this is why we have so many people from overseas, despite our skill shortage. We have doctors and engineers and school professors who are working as car guards often, or who are living on the streets out of sheer desperation. We tried to get Home Affairs to attend the conference. Unfortunately, we weren't very successful, but we will keep trying, because that is another element that needs to be incorporated into our initiatives. We need to get Home Affairs to come along. There are some suburbs with entire groups of people that are living on the streets because they have a problem with papers. They don't have papers and therefore they are stuck. So if we can manage to negotiate something with Home Affairs, get them legalized, then that might just be the hand up that they need. So this is why we talk about displaced people. The different groups, the fact that it's a heterogeneous group, the fact that this heterogeneous group therefore requires a multi-pronged approach. And when I say multi-pronged approach, we're not just talking about a multi-pronged approach because of the different groups. We're also talking about the fact that we are here today, city officials, NGOs, church groups, residents, and some people from the private sector as well. And that is also what I mean by a multi-pronged approach. We need to understand that this is not just government's problem, and that government alone cannot solve the problem of displaced people. The community needs to get involved, and we need to take some responsibility for the people that are in effect living in our communities, members of our communities. And we have a group here today, and we're going to be listening to Mary Gillet de Cllr, who is going to be talking to us about exactly that, about how Ferndale and Randburg took responsibility for the people living on their streets, and they have been actually very, very successful. So we're going to be hearing from Mary in about 2 minutes. If we could just carry on. The reason why I'm showing this to you now is because I'd like us to keep this in mind for the end of the day. This is our objective, and we need to flesh this out for the end of the day. So we want to talk about what the law says. I spoke to you about the Constitution, national law, and the bylaws. The various protocols. What is the protocol for reporting displaced people? Who do you call when you have a group of people living on the streets? Of course, there is SAPS and the JMPD. Here, last time, I think we emphasized very clearly the fact that yes, SAPS can get involved, and I'm very, very happy, thank you so much to the members of SAPS that are here present representing law enforcement today. Unfortunately, the JMPD is not here, but SAPS can get involved and the JMPD can get involved because it is both potentially an issue that cuts across the jurisdiction and mandates of SAPS and the JMPD. So we talk about who to contact and why. The protocol for mental illness and addiction we'll hear about later. The protocol for removing displaced people. When we say removing, it's about getting the Displaced Peoples Unit in. The Displaced Peoples Unit, we'll hear later from them. What they generally do is they come in and they collect the people living on the streets, and then they put them through an assessment process to find out who they are, why they're on the streets, what their needs are, do they have homes and families that they can be reunited with, do they have an addiction, etc., so that we know exactly which channel to take them to. But the Displaced Peoples Unit also need assistance. Sometimes they need the assistance of SAPS. SAPS has to go along and provide protection sometimes for the Displaced Peoples Unit, because as we said, sometimes there are criminal elements, sometimes there are people who are very resistant because they want to stay on the streets because of, more often than not, it's because of an addiction, or sometimes it's because of mental illness. So what are the protocols? SAPS, JMPD, Displaced Peoples Unit, we need Home Affairs to get involved. And then also, there are many NGOs and church groups who are doing some wonderful work already with the communities, and we're going to be hearing from them this afternoon. I'm very happy to see the Jan Smuts Axis of Churches here today. They're going to be showing us a video of what they're already doing in their suburbs, and the role of residents and communities we'll talk about as well. Next, please, Tuso. In terms of contacts, I think this is probably the heart of the handbook. People very often just don't know who to contact, and that includes sometimes SAPS. I remember Warrant Officer Small smiling from ear to ear at our last workshop when he realized that it wasn't just his problem, that there were actually people that could support him and help him, and places where we could take displaced people to. And also other contacts like rehabilitation centers, medical facilities. There are very often people who have serious medical problems who are living on the streets, and where can we take them to? Orphanages and schools, and I think we've covered all of that. Next is funding. Now, I've spoken about the need for rehabilitation centres. Obviously this requires funding. There are some NGOs who are providing shelters but require funding. We need funding. I will arrange funding for the guide, for the handbook, so that we can get a sponsor. I was actually thinking about people like Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's, because they happen to be they also happen to be the location where we have a lot of displaced people in Melville. Everybody knows about the Kentucky location and the McDonald's location, so why not get them to sponsor our handbook? Or even the Shell Garage. and funding for running shelters and drop-in centres. And when I say funding, we're not just talking about collecting funds from the private sector and from residents or the community. We're also talking about funding that is available from government. I think Anne Cllr is coming a little bit later on today. Anne, you're not here? Not yet. She's coming a little bit later on, and in our last workshop, we were very excited to hear that the Department of Social Assistance provides funding for non-governmental organizations, which would include church groups, who are currently providing shelter or providing assistance to displaced people. And I think it amounted to 50,000 a year, which is not an enormous sum of money, but for a lot of organizations that can actually go a long way. And any support that we can get is fantastic. So I think that's the last slide, isn't it, Tiso? Thank you. So that's a breakdown of what we are trying to do here. I want to thank you once again for being here. And I haven't mentioned the councillors. We have 3 councillors here today. If councillors can just put their hands up. Thank you very much for being here. They are representing their wards.
It's 4 councillors.
Is it 4? Where? Oh, and me. That's 4 councillors that are here today representing their wards, and we are really looking forward to your input as well to help us to make a difference as well. So thank you all for being here, and I'd like to call upon Mary for her presentation, and it's going to be a presentation on Ferndale and Randburg and the fabulous work that they've been doing there, which I think we can all learn from. This is a case study, ladies and gentlemen, so let's see what we can learn from Mary. Thank you.